In the quaint town of Aldridge, nestled between overgrown forest paths and the winding river that cut through the landscape, stood an old coffee shop known as the Steaming Bean. It had once been a mill, humming with activity and life, but as the years drew on and the industry waned, it found new life as a gathering place for coffee lovers and those seeking the warmth of good company. The exposed brick walls, rustic wooden beams, and the constant, comforting sound of coffee being ground and brewed made it a local favorite. However, beneath its cozy exterior, a darker history whispered through the cracks and crevices of the old building. The first tale, the barista's lament. Jenny had been a barista at the Steaming Bean for several years. Friendly and diligent, she knew her regulars by name and their orders by heart. One evening, as autumn leaves painted the ground in fiery hues and a cool breeze hinted at the coming winter, Jenny encountered a customer she would never forget. The man appeared during a particularly quiet hour, just as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the floor. He was tall, his features obscured by a large, worn-out hood, and he moved with a strange, unsettling grace. His order was peculiar, a simple black coffee, but he insisted on having it brewed from a blend that Jenny had never heard of, which he supplied himself. It was an old, unmarked bag of beans, their aroma potent and oddly metallic. Feeling a chill she attributed to the drafty old building, Jenny prepared his coffee with trembling hands. The grinder seemed to wail in protest, and the espresso machine hissed like an angry serpent. When she handed him the cup, their fingers briefly touched, and she recoiled at his icy grip. The man sat in the darkest corner of the shop, sipping his coffee slowly, never once removing his hood. Hours passed, and one by one, the other customers left, casting wary glances his way. Jenny's attempts to clean around him were met with an intense feeling of being watched, and whenever she glanced in his direction, she found his shadowy figure staring back at her, his face never fully visible. As closing time approached, Jenny's nerves reached their breaking point. She approached the man to tell him the shop was closing, but as she neared his table, she noticed the cup was still full. He hadn't drunk a sip. The air around him was unnaturally cold, and as she prompted him to leave, he finally looked up. Beneath their hood, his face was pale, too smooth, with eyes that seemed to reflect the depths of the night itself. In a voice that echoed with a timbre both beautiful and terrifying, he spoke, "Thank you for the brew. I will come again." He left a single, old coin on the table, a currency long out of use, and vanished into the night. After he left, Jenny found the air easier to breathe, but the chill lingered. She locked up, every sound echoing ominously through the empty coffee shop, and hurried home, haunted by the man's parting words. The second tale, Whispers from the Walls. Mark, a local writer, often frequented the Steaming Bean for its quiet atmosphere, which helped him concentrate on his work. However, one evening, as a storm raged outside, his solitude was disturbed by something within the walls themselves. As he typed away on his laptop, a faint whispering filled the air, almost drowned out by the storm. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, but as the evening progressed, the whispering grew louder, clearer. It seemed to come from the walls, the very heart of the building. He strained to understand the words, catching snippets of sentences, tales of sorrow, and dark deeds hidden by time. Frightened but intrigued, Mark moved from table to table, trying to locate the source. The whispers seemed to be strongest near the fireplace, where an old portrait of the mill's original owner hung. As he stared at the painting, the eyes seemed to follow him, and the whispering intensified, imploring him to look closer. Compelled by a force he couldn't resist, Mark reached out and touched the frame. The moment his skin made contact, the whole room shifted. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath him trembled. The whispers turned into shouts, and the portrait's expression twisted into something grotesque, its eyes bleeding into dark, ink-like tears. Terrified, Mark stumbled back, knocking over his chair. The room returned to normal, but the whispers still hung in the air, now tinged with malice. He gathered his things and fled into the stormy night, the words of the whispers echoing in his mind, promising that there was more to be revealed. The third tale, the last closing shift. Emily, the newest employee at the steaming bean, had heard stories from her colleagues about odd occurrences, but she chalked it up to their love of a good scare, until she had to close up alone for the first time. It was a foggy night, the kind where the mist hangs so thick you can barely see your hand in front of your face. The cafe was unusually busy that day, with the fog driving people indoors seeking warmth and a hot drink. By closing time, Emily was exhausted but wary of being alone in the shop, especially after the stories she'd heard. As she began her closing duties, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, jumping at shadows in the corners of her eyes. The old wooden floors creaked under her steps, sounding almost like hushed footsteps following just behind her. When she turned, there was never anyone there. As she wiped down the tables, she heard faint music playing, a haunting melody that seemed to seep from the very walls of the cafe. The sound was old, crackling as if played on a phonograph, the tune slow and mournful. Emily searched for the source, but it seemed to move, floating through the cafe like a living thing. Finishing up, Emily locked the front door and headed to the back to turn off the lights. That's when she heard it, a loud slam from the front of the cafe. Her heart raced as she cautiously made her way back. The front door she had just locked was now wide open, banging against the wall with each gust of wind that swept through the fog outside. Her hands trembling, Emily closed the door again, locking it with shaking fingers. She turned to head back, only to see a figure standing at the end of the counter, shrouded in shadow. She froze, squinting to make out any features, but it was too dark. The figure stood motionless, and just as Emily gathered the courage to call out, it vanished. Rushing to turn on the lights, Emily found herself alone in the cafe again. The air felt charged, and the faint sound of the music still played, weaving through the silence. She knew she hadn't imagined it. With every fiber of her being screaming to leave, she quickly finished shutting down, her hands barely able to function as they trembled. The drive home was nerve-wracking, every shadow by the roadside seeming to morph into figures watching her pass. When she finally reached home, she locked the doors and checked all the windows, the fear from the cafe following her. The night was restless, filled with nightmares of shadowy figures and whispered threats. When morning came, Emily was almost relieved to return to the cafe, the daylight dispelling some of her fear, until she entered and saw that one of the chairs was moved to the center of the room, sitting perfectly upright as if waiting for its phantom occupant to return. The fourth tale, Echoes of the Past. Thomas, a local historian, was fascinated by the building's history and often spent hours at the cafe, going through old records and photographs. One particular evening, he brought in a tape recorder to capture the ambient sounds of the building, hoping to document the acoustics of the old mill structure. As he reviewed the recordings at home, Thomas heard something unexpected, a voice, faint but clear, amid the background noise of the cafe. It whispered, "Find me," over and over. Intrigued and unnerved, Thomas returned to the steaming bin the next day, headphones in ears, listening intently to the tape as he walked around the cafe. The voice grew louder near the back wall of the cafe, an area that had been part of the original mill structure. As he listened, other voices began to emerge, a cacophony of whispers, each one pleading for attention. "Help us, don't forget, why did you leave us?" the voices asked, each one laden with sorrow and anger. Thomas, compelled by the voices, started to research the wall's history. He discovered that the mill had burned down once before being rebuilt and converted into the cafe. Several workers had perished in the fire, their bodies never recovered from the rubble. The wall, it seemed, was part of the original structure that had survived the fire. Armed with this knowledge, Thomas returned to the cafe, his equipment more sophisticated this time. He set up audio and video recorders, determined to uncover more about the voices. As the night deepened, the whispers grew into desperate cries, and the temperature in the cafe dropped sharply. His breath visible in the air, Thomas felt a chill that went beyond the physical, a chill of souls long lost, reaching out from the shadows of the past. He was so engrossed in his monitoring that he didn't notice the shadows deepening, coalescing into forms around him. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. The equipment started to malfunction, screens flickering and static overwhelming the audio channels. Through the chaos, Thomas heard a new voice, louder and more authoritative than the others. It boomed through the cacophony, silencing the other whispers momentarily. "Uncover the truth," it demanded, its tone resonant and commanding. Thomas, despite his fear, felt a surge of determination. He responded aloud, "I will. Tell me what happened." The air seemed to pulsate with energy as he spoke, the shadows around him swirling with increased intensity. The voices resumed, this time with a clear narrative. They spoke of the fire, describing harrowing scenes of chaos and despair. Workers trapped behind the very wall before him, their cries for help unheard over the roar of the flames. Thomas listened, horrified, as the voices recounted their final moments, their lives extinguished in smoke and ash. As the story unfolded, the temperature dropped further, the cafe enveloped in an icy grip. Thomas felt the weight of the trapped souls' anguish, their need for recognition, for their story to be known. He promised them, whispering into the recorder, "I will tell your story. I will make sure you are remembered." The equipment flickered wildly, then stabilized as if the spirits were appeased by his vow. The shadows receded slightly, the air lightening as the voices faded, their message delivered. Thomas packed up his equipment, his mind reeling from the encounter. He left the cafe as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the normal sounds of morning seeming alien after the night's supernatural revelations. Back at home, Thomas began compiling the recordings, his research taking on new urgency. He planned to present his findings to the local historical society, hoping to honor the memory of those lost by installing a memorial at the cafe. As he worked, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unresolved, something crucial that the spirits had not yet revealed. The fifth tale, the midnight patron. A few nights later, Sarah, a regular customer known for her late-night visits to work on her novels, entered the cafe. The staff knew her well, always setting up her favorite secluded table with a fresh pot of coffee. This night, however, the atmosphere felt different to Sarah. The air was heavier, charged with a subtle tension. As she settled down, her laptop open and ready, she noticed a flickering at the edge of her vision. Assuming it was just fatigue, she focused on her writing, but the flickering grew more persistent, accompanied by a low murmur she couldn't quite ignore. Looking up, Sarah saw that the other patron seemed oblivious to the disturbance. She stood, her curiosity overcoming her trepidation, and followed the flickering, which led her to the back of the cafe, near the same wall that Thomas had investigated. As she approached, the murmuring coalesced into a whisper, just audible over the background noise of the cafe. "Look closer," it urged. Sarah, driven by a mix of fear and intrigue, moved closer to the wall, her hands reaching out almost of their own accord. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the cafe lights dimmed, plunging her into near darkness. The whisper grew into a cacophony of voices, the same ones Thomas had recorded, now pleading directly with her. "Free us," they begged. Panicked yet compelled, Sarah searched the wall, her hands guided by the voices. Underneath a loose brick, she found an old, rusty key with a tag attached. Engraved on the tag was a date, the exact date of the fire, and the name of the mill. The discovery sent a chill down her spine. The key felt heavy with significance, heavier than its small size warranted. She knew, instinctively, that it was important, perhaps the final piece in the puzzle of the old mill's tragic past. Sarah took the key to the counter, intending to ask the staff about it, but as she turned around, she saw that the cafe had changed. The patrons were gone, the staff too, and in their place were shadows, flickering and whispering among themselves. She was alone, or nearly so. The cafe transformed into a realm of spirits and echoes. Frightened but resolute, Sarah realized that her night of writing had turned into something else entirely, an opportunity, perhaps an obligation, to resolve the unrest that lingered in this place. She held the key tightly, knowing it was a symbol of hope for the trapped souls, a means to unlock the truth of what had happened and perhaps free them at last. As she stood there, contemplating her next move, the air around her grew colder, the whispers louder. Sarah was at the heart of the cafe's mystery now, the line between the past and present blurred. She knew she had to decide whether to delve deeper into the supernatural history of the steaming bean or to retreat and leave the voices to their eternal whispering. Shop named Whispering Grounds, known for its Gothic architecture and the mysterious aura that enveloped it. Its walls, thick with ivy, held stories of the past that murmured into the ears of the present. Though popular for its robust coffee and the antiquity it preserved, not all who visited left with just a caffeine high, some left with tales that chilled the bone. The opening tale, the barista who knew too much. Evelyn, the head barista, had an uncanny knack for knowing her customers' orders before they spoke. It was said she could read minds, a skill that amused patrons but unsettled newcomers. Late one stormy evening, a man in a trench coat entered, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. As he approached the counter, Evelyn smiled and began preparing a double espresso. "You seem to need something strong to wash away the gloom," she said without looking up. The man stiffened, his voice a low rasp. "How did you know what I drink?" "It's my job to know," she replied, her eyes finally meeting his. There was a flicker of something dark in her gaze that made the man uneasy. He took the coffee, found a secluded table, and watched her. Evelyn seemed to float rather than walk, her movements smooth and eerily precise. As the night deepened, the man's attention never wavered from Evelyn. When the last customer left, she approached him. "Curious about me?" she inquired, a slight edge to her tone. "Why are you so different?" he asked bluntly. Evelyn leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I see things others can't." "Would you like to know what I see about you?" The man nodded, swallowed by his intrigue. Evelyn's eyes darkened. "I see darkness in you, seeking out darkness in others." Shaken, the man rose to leave, tossing a crumpled bill on the table. Evelyn called after him, her voice hauntingly sweet, "Be careful in the dark, not all shadows are empty." As the man exited, the wind slammed the door shut behind him, and the whispering started. It came from the corners, the ceiling, the very air he breathed. Fleeing into the night, the man's heart pounded not just with fear but with the dreadful knowledge that Evelyn's eyes had seen right through to his soul, and what she saw was terrifying. The second tale, Midnight's Customer. Lara, a regular night shift writer, loved the peaceful ambience of Whispering Grounds for her creative work. One midnight, as she typed away, engrossed in her latest horror story, the bell above the door jingled. An old woman entered, her back hunched, her fingers clutching a worn leather journal. Lara watched as the woman ordered nothing, instead taking a seat opposite her, opening the journal, and beginning to write feverishly. The woman's presence filled the coffee shop with a palpable tension, her pen scratching loudly against the paper in the otherwise silent room. Curiosity overcoming her, Lara approached the woman, asking if she needed anything. The woman looked up, her eyes cloudy and distant. "I'm finishing what they started," she whispered, gesturing to the journal. Lara glanced at the open page. It was filled with names and dates, each entry meticulously documented. "Who are they?" Lara asked, a chill crawling up her spine. "The ones who never left," the old woman replied, her voice a hollow echo. As she spoke, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. The air around them thickened, the earlier calm of the coffee shop spiraling into a vortex of whispered voices and cold drafts. Lara stepped back, her mind racing with the implications of the woman's words. What do you mean, never left? This place? Yes, dear. They're here, with us, now. The woman's eyes shifted past Lara, focusing on something unseen. Lara turned to follow her gaze but saw nothing. Terrified yet transfixed, Lara returned to her seat, her eyes stealing glances at the mysterious old woman who wrote on, undisturbed by the supernatural storm she had conjured. Lara's laptop screen blinked rapidly, a document opening and closing on its own, displaying a new entry that matched the old woman's handwriting. It read, "You're part of the story now." ### the third tale, the last closing. Michael, a skeptic and a new employee, scoffed at the tales of hauntings at Whispering Grounds. Determined to prove the stories wrong, he volunteered for the closing shift. As the clock struck midnight, marking the beginning of his solo tenure, the cafe's atmosphere shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, dancing along the periphery of his vision. He laughed nervously, attempting to dismiss the eerie feeling as he began to clean up. Suddenly, the espresso machine whirred to life on its own, spewing steam and hissing like an angry serpent. Michael jumped back, startled, and turned the machine off, mumbling about faulty wiring. Yet, as he turned away, the machine started again, this time louder, more aggressive. Trying to regain his composure, Michael decided to ignore the machine and continue cleaning. That's when he heard the soft, melodious humming. It was a tune he hadn't heard before, yet it felt strangely familiar, as if woven from the threads of forgotten memories. Their humming grew louder, and Michael spun around, expecting to confront a practical joker. Instead, he found the cafe empty, the humming now enveloping him in a spectral lullaby. "Who's there?" Michael called out, his voice echoing slightly in the now eerily quiet coffee shop. No response came, only the continuation of the haunting melody. He felt a chill trace down his spine as he realized the temperature had dropped significantly. His breath was visible in the air, forming misty clouds that seemed to linger longer than natural. Michael's skepticism began to falter as he felt an undeniable sense of dread wash over him. He hurried to finish his tasks, each movement hurried and jerky, as if driven by a primal urge to flee. As he wiped down the last table, he noticed a cup that hadn't been there before. It was steaming hot, as if freshly made. Beside it lay a note, written in an elegant, flowing script that read, "Drink and see." His hand trembled as he reached for the cup, the aroma of the coffee strangely enticing. Michael lifted the cup, the steam caressing his face, but something deep within him screamed to stop. He placed the cup back down and stepped away, just as the lights flickered violently, plunging him into darkness. When the lights returned, Michael was no longer alone. Across the room, a figure sat at one of the tables, its back to him. It was cloaked in shadows, unmoving, and though he couldn't see its face, Michael felt its gaze upon him, piercing and intense. Their humming had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to roar in his ears. Summoning every ounce of courage, Michael approached the figure, his footsteps slow and hesitant. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, his voice a mix of fear and defiance. The figure remained silent, and as Michael reached the table, it slowly turned to face him. The face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood, but from the darkness, two luminous eyes stared back at him, glowing faintly with a ghostly light. The sight rooted Michael to the spot, his heart pounding wildly against his ribs. The figure lifted a hand, pointing a finger directly at Michael, and in a voice that was both a whisper and a wail, it spoke, "Look deeper, Michael. See what lies beneath." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, before the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Michael alone once again. Michael stood frozen, his mind racing. He looked down at the cup of coffee, the steam still rising invitingly. With a mixture of trepidation and an inexplicable compulsion, he reached for the cup again, his hand steady this time. As his fingers closed around it, the cafe began to change. The walls aged and peeled before his eyes, revealing older layers of wallpaper and ancient stone beneath. The air filled with the sounds of whispers, laughter, and cries, a cacophony of lives past echoing through the once silent cafe. Realization dawned on Michael as he sipped the coffee, the rich, dark flavor flooding his senses. Whispering Grounds was more than just a coffee shop. It was a nexus of histories, a gathering place for souls, and he was now a part of its legacy. As he drank, the shadows seemed to dance, celebrating their new acolyte, their whispers weaving into his thoughts. As the first hints of dawn crept through the windows, Michael set the cup down, its contents gone, his fear replaced by a deep, unsettling understanding. The shop was quiet now, the storm of spectral activity having passed, but the weight of the night's revelations hung heavily in the air. Michael knew he couldn't just leave, he was intertwined with the place now, a keeper of its secrets. And as he prepared to lock up, he glanced back at the cup, a new note lying beside it. This time, the message was simple: welcome to the fold. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the note, the words etched deeply not just on the paper but into his mind. The reality of his new role at Whispering Grounds was sinking in, a commitment marked by the mysterious and haunting experiences of the night. As the dawn light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, he felt a connection to the coffee shop that went beyond mere employment. For the rest of the morning, Michael moved through his tasks in a trance-like state, each motion infused with a newfound respect and fear for the premises. He was no longer just a barista, he was a guardian of secrets, a bridge between the ethereal inhabitants and the living customers who came seeking solace in their coffee cups. Later that day, as the morning rush slowed to a peaceful lull, a young woman entered the cafe. She was an artist known to the staff for her quiet demeanor and the sketchbook she always carried. Today, however, her eyes were wide with fright, her usual calm replaced by a nervous energy. She approached Michael directly, her voice low. "I need to speak with you about something strange that happened here last night," she said, glancing around as if fearing the walls themselves might be listening. Michael nodded, a sense of foreboding settling over him. "Let's sit," he suggested, leading her to a secluded corner of the cafe. As they sat, the artist took a deep breath, her hands clasping her sketchbook tightly. "I was here, late, working on some drawings," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I fell asleep for a while. When I woke up, the cafe was empty, and I started to hear voices. They were whispering, talking to me, asking for my help." Michael listened intently, his recent experiences making him all too receptive to her story. "What did they want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chill creeping up his spine. They showed me images, visions of the past and the future, all blending together. They were trapped here, some of them, not able to move on. They sensed that I could see them, and they clung to me," she explained, her eyes searching his for understanding. Michael nodded, feeling the weight of his own encounter the previous night. "You're not alone in this. Something similar happened to me. This place, it's more than just a coffee shop. It's a crossroads for lost souls, and it seems we can perceive them, connect with them somehow." The artist looked relieved to not be alone in her experiences, but still visibly shaken. "What do we do, then? We can't just ignore them, can we?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and resolve. "No, we can't," Michael agreed, his decision firm. "We need to find out what they want, help them if we can. Perhaps that's why we're both here, why we've been drawn to this place." Together, they agreed to delve deeper into the mysteries of Whispering Grounds, to understand its history, the spirits that lingered, and what could be done to aid them. Over the following weeks, they became partners in this unchosen path, their nights spent listening, watching, and sometimes, soothing the restless spirits that made their presence felt. As days turned into weeks, Michael and the artist began to document their experiences, compiling notes and sketches, recordings of voices, and even capturing fleeting images of apparitions. The coffee shop became their research center, a lab for their inquiries into the paranormal. But as they delved deeper, the boundaries between the living and the spectral seemed to blur even more. Customers began to notice, feeling the eerie atmosphere, glimpsing the occasional flicker of an apparition. Whispering Grounds was becoming known not just for its coffee, but as a place where the veil between worlds was thin. As the story spread, more came, drawn by curiosity or by a deeper, unspoken need to connect with the beyond. Michael and the artist knew that their journey was far from over. Each discovery led to more questions, each encounter with the spirits deepening the mystery that shrouded the old coffee shop. And so, as Michael locked up the cafe one chilly evening, preparing for another night of exploration and communion with the unseen, he reflected on how much had changed. Whispering Grounds was no longer just a part of his daily routine, it was his destiny, intertwined with the souls of those past and the lives of those present. And as he turned the key in the lock, he felt a chill pass through him, a whisper from the shadows, reminding him that the story was far from over. As the seasons shifted and leaves began to carpet the sidewalk outside Whispering Grounds, Michael and the artist had become deeply entrenched in their roles as custodians of the threshold between the seen and the unseen. The coffee shop, with its Gothic arches and aged wood, seemed almost alive, breathing with the stories of those who had passed through, both living and spectral. On a particularly cold and moonless night, when the wind howled like the lost souls themselves, an unusual electric charge filled the air. Michael was locking up, the final click of the key echoing unusually loud in the silence, when he felt a piercing cold that made him turn sharply. Standing at the window, looking in with eyes that shimmered with a ghostly luminescence, was a figure that he had seen many times in the shadows of the cafe, but never this clear, never this close. The figure, a tall, gaunt man in a Victorian suit, his eyes sad and knowing, raised his hand in a silent farewell, or was it a warning? Michael, his breath visible in the frigid air, stepped back, the weight of the man's gaze almost physical. He rushed back into the cafe, the warmth of the inside doing little to calm his chilled bones. As he turned to face the window again, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. But on the inside of the glass, a message had appeared, fogged onto the surface: protect the gateway. From that night on, Michael's duties transcended those of a typical barrister. Whispering Grounds had chosen him, and he embraced his role not out of obligation, but out of a deep-seated calling. He and the artist continued their vigilant watch over the cafe, ensuring it remained a safe conduit for those souls in need of passage, a beacon for those lost in the shadows. As the years passed, stories of the haunted coffee shop spread far and wide, drawing both thrill-seekers and true seekers of the paranormal. Michael, ever the guardian, met each with the same stern warmth, ensuring the true nature of the cafe was respected and preserved. On the anniversary of his first encounter, Michael stood before the now well-worn counter, the evening's last coffee brewed, the doors locked to the public. He and the artist, along with a small group of trusted regulars, held a vigil, a small, private ceremony to honor the spirits they had helped and those still passing through. As candles flickered and shadows danced across the walls of Whispering Grounds, a soft chorus of whispers filled the room, a susurrus of thanks and peace from the spectral visitors. Michael knew then that his life's work was more than serving coffee, it was serving the thin veil between worlds, nurturing it, protecting it. With a final glance around the now quiet cafe, he extinguished the candles one by one, the whispers fading into a comforting silence. Locking the door behind him, he stepped out into the night, the moon casting a silvery glow over the cobblestone path. The air was crisp, the world serene, as if in acknowledgement of the peace brokered within the walls of Whispering Grounds. Michael walked away, the keys to the cafe jingling softly in his pocket, a sound mingled with the distant echo of a phantom melody, the heartbeat of the cafe. The gateway was safe, the passage secured, and as he disappeared into the night, the old coffee shop stood as a sentinel on the threshold of realms, its story a whispered legend in the wind.